Last year I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local newspaper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave him a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that I would have to stay in a room alone with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there I would visualize a double of myself. They called this my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I'd be paid. And the next day I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed. They attached the sensors to my head and hooked them up to a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through a process of visualizing my double again, and then explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, that I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes and then I'd grow distracted, but by the fourth day I can imagine him and keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The second week they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, and what sounded like an old school modem dialing up. And guttural voices speaking in foreign languages. I just laughed it off. I was pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We had conversations, we'd play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling or breakdancing, or whatever caught my fancy at the time. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect the study, but they encouraged me. So I played and communicated, and it was fun for a while, but then it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I told him my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was wearing a green one. I thought about it for a second, and then I realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. "You're using the thought form to access your subconscious," they explained. "You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself." What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found out that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I can make it quote whole pages of books I'd only read once, years before, or things I was taught immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it seemed odd not to see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him while I was hanging out with my friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak to him out loud, so I was able to carry out conversations with him and nobody was the wiser. I know it sounds strange, but It was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of all I knew, everything I had forgotten, he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize that I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date that I brought him on was going badly, but then he pointed out how she was laughing a little bit too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke. A bunch of other subtle clues that I wasn't picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me like they were confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions. Why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them. But I did, or at least I could ask myself for the answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded on my door until I answered. He came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him, and I probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my Tulpa grew suddenly furious. "Hit him," it said. And before I knew it, I was doing. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor, and then he came up swinging. We beat each other down in my apartment. I was more furious than I'd ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground, and I gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs. And that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by in a few minutes after that, but I told him that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they'd let me off with a warning. My Tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning that I checked my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, and I remembered what set me off. My double was the one that had grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he'd goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and he knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained this to the researchers, and the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed. "You can't be scared of something you're imagining," one told me. My double stood behind him, nodded his head, and smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my Tulpa. And it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller, more menacing. His eyes twinkled with a sort of mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him that, at this point, visualizing was an automatic process. So I started trying my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere now. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him, and there he'd be in that howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressively large men grabbed me and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor, back in the room, strapped in the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me and cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted, his eyes were sunken into their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted and his fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed my restraints as best I could, but I could hardly move at all.
They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind, all fuzzy?
He leaned closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there scolding me, and then he cut her throat, and the blood showered me. It was so real, I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers, but they never spoke to me. They may have talked to my tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not really sure, but I was so doped and confused that it may have just been more delusion. But I remembered them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one and that I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought sometimes and mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. He could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me, as if he felt I wasn't paying attention to him. Once he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have the scar. Most days I convinced myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days, anyway. Then one day, while he was telling me about a story, about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A querulous look crossed his face, and he reached out and touched my head like my mother used when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment and then smiled.
All thoughts are creative,
he then told me, and then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it downstairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed like a weeping child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually, I don't remember how. I unlocked the door and shoved the dresser against it. I took a long shower and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night. Nobody came the next day, and no one after that. It was over. I'd spent a week locked in that room, but it felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was completely empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given were aliases. Even the money I retrieved was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much. My nightmares are terrible. It's all over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself, and it worked sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister is the latest victim of a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims and then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was a lovely service, as lovely as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff. It sounds like feedback and shrieking and a modem dialing up. I can hear it. A little louder now.